Even though his career's taken a nosedive since his move to McLaren, Daniel Ricciardo hasn't let any of it actually get to his head, especially now that he's got a reserve driver role at Red Bull. But while he may not have won as much as he would have liked at McLaren and Renault, he's still not leaving empty-handed. In today's video, we're going to talk about Ricciardo's truth bomb, a payday, and more, so keep watching. First up, Ricciardo cashed out after losing championship hopes. When you look back at the Honey Badger's career over the past decade or so, his demise has been strange to say the least. After all, he was one of, if not the most exciting young driver on the grid during those early Red Bull days. That said, even when he had some experience under his belt and was the older driver next to Verstappen, he was still outpacing the Dutchman regularly. Oh, and it wasn't just sheer pace either. The guy's racecraft was unlike anything we'd seen at the time, especially when it came to those last-ditch overtakes. Something changed though. Within a span of merely 4 years, Danny Rich went from winning the race in Monaco to struggling for points at the back. But even though his Formula One pedigree is now in shambles, the Australian did actually get something positive out of his struggles. Money. Yep, it looks like he could somehow foreshadow his demise from a million miles away and decided to make some cash while he was still valuable for teams. Or, well, it could have just been a self-fulfilling prophecy, because you know, if you're already opting for money rather than competitiveness, then you're probably destined to fail anyway. Obviously, things are a lot more nuanced here, as apparently Daniel had the choice of either playing second fiddle to Verstappen at Red Bull or cashing out and moving to Renault instead. Besides, with Max as the #1 driver on the team, he wasn't gonna get dibs on a world championship pursuit anyway. Up next, Daniel knew Renault wasn't a title challenger. Of course, we all know that Ricciardo ended up making an incredibly shocking exit from Red Bull to join the French team, but what we didn't know was his thought process for doing so. Yeah, we know there was a whole Drive to Survive episode dedicated to this. Plus, the Honey Badger has talked to the media multiple times about his move too. That said, there's more to this story than just that. Now, the notion was that Renault was an underdevelopment works team and needed an experienced driver like Daniel to catapult them to the top. After all, they did have the money to do it. What's more, he'd also said multiple times that things were just getting a bit too toxic at Red Bull, especially with all the on-track fights he was having with Max, so he just needed to move out of the team to a place where he'd find a bit more room to breathe. Well, turns out he may have omitted a little detail from his interviews, cause while we're sure all these reasons are perfectly valid, the Honey Badger also knew he was gonna get the biggest payday of his life. Yep, according to former Jordan, Red Bull, and Cosworth executive Mark Gallagher, the Aussie was chasing money and opted to take the leap of faith over to Renault because he always knew he wasn't going to win a championship. In fact, he wasn't even promised a title-challenging car by the French outfit, though it still may have been a smart move on the Aussie's part. Coming up, Ricciardo's move made perfect sense for him. Apparently, Danny Rich's deal at Renault was worth around $50 million, which back then would have been enough to make him one of the top earners on the grid. Not to mention, he was the top dog over there, as Hülkenberg was never really in contention for anything substantial anyway. As a matter of fact, the team principal back then, Cyril Abiteboul, even promised to get a tattoo if the Honey Badger could score a podium for the team. So everything was perfectly set up for the Aussie to succeed and prove his worth to everyone who'd ever doubted him at Red Bull. Oh, and that's what Gallagher said in his recent interview with GP Racing magazine too, that Ricciardo just decided he was gonna make the move during a flight. What's more, Abiteboul had promised him a massive amount of money as compensation for losing his competitive edge. Besides, it all made perfect sense for someone like him, because not only was he entering his 30s, but his championship dream was pretty much over too. So why wouldn't you take the money at that point, especially if it's a life-changing amount? Not to mention, the Honey Badger wasn't bad at Renault either. In fact, the team did sort of manage to get their money's worth out of him, as he delivered consistent results, and of course that coveted podium position as well. Here's the fascinating thing though, the Australian's McLaren move was also meant to be very similar in terms of its structure and expectations, but for some bizarre reason, it all kinda went downhill after that. What's more, the Australian never cared about championship opportunities. Obviously, hindsight is 20/20, so it's easy to say these things now. Still, it's not hard to see the pattern with Ricciardo's career moves over the years. In fact, even now, he's just cashed in a $36 million check from McLaren after parting ways. The point is that even though there's been some desire from Daniel to compete in Formula One, it's been far outweighed by his pursuit of financially lucrative opportunities. Now, remember, he was managed by Glenn Beavis back in his Red Bull days before the two had a falling out, and now he's managed by sports management giant CAA, who has a very different approach to handling things. Besides, you can feel the shift in the Honey Badger's decision-making over the years too, though his age may have been a factor in that. Then again, it's not like Red Bull was the strongest team on the grid when he left them either. In fact, if anything, things weren't looking great for the energy drinks outfit, as they'd been struggling with the reliability of Honda engines for quite a while and were the third best team on the grid. So even though the moves never quite worked out the way he'd hoped, the thought process that led him there wasn't that flawed. Not to mention, Ricciardo doesn't regret his career moves. If the man himself is happy with the way he steered his career, then who are we to judge him? After all, he did sort of have to take a gamble gamble and do something radical, especially when things got a bit too toxic at Red Bull. Speaking on Formula One's Beyond the Grid podcast, the Honey Badger went into detail about his move away from Red Bull. And according to him, there's no point in looking at things in the rearview mirror, because back then, these were all hypotheticals. Obviously, he still admitted that he probably would have had more podiums if he'd stayed put, but at the same time, he needed to move on with his life, because he needed to change. What's more, you never really know how things would have panned out if he'd stayed anyway. Like, would he have been the one fighting Hamilton for the title instead of Verstappen? Probably not. So, when you're not competing for the title anyway, then does any of it actually matter in the grand scheme of things? When you look at it from that angle, his decision to cash out rather than linger around in a team that didn't want him does start to make more sense. Moving on, McLaren appreciated Ricciardo's resolve during his struggles. Formula One fans can sometimes get hyper-fixated on the drivers and forget that the teams themselves are also taking a gamble with these moves. After all, you don't pay big money to someone if you're not expecting them to make some valuable contribution to your team. So even though both Renault and McLaren promised Daniel a big payout, they just didn't hire him to sit around and do nothing. He was there to race. And to be fair to the Aussie, he never really backed down from that promise, even when he was at absolute rock bottom. In fact, according to the new team boss at McLaren, Andrea Stella, Ricciardo's been a breath of fresh air and has been nothing but positive amidst all this chaos. Speaking with Motorsport.com, he said that it would have been very easy for the driver to create a toxic environment, especially right before his imminent departure. But instead, he's been super collaborative, positive, and constructive, even when he's had difficult weekends. What's more, he's been incredibly calm and composed over this whole period, which is rare for any driver in his position.
You know, that was fun, and I feel like I crossed the line having put in, at least a solid effort, so that makes me feel a little more fulfilled.
As a matter of fact, we've actually seen multiple drivers lose their cool in the past after hitting roadblocks with the team and losing their seats. So the Honey Badger definitely does deserve some credit for being an absolute champ throughout it all. Seriously though, he hasn't uttered a single bad word about McLaren, its management, or his replacement Oscar Piastri, which, again, what a guy. Finally, Daniel's issues had a positive outcome for McLaren. Now, Stella went on to talk about how things can go into a negative spiral environmentally when you've got an unhappy driver in your ranks. But Ricciardo was always adamant about helping the team analyze all the data and determine the actual issue. He never pointed any fingers at anyone and took full responsibility for his shortcomings. And that's why the team somehow managed to gain a lot of technical knowledge from the difficulties too, which is super rare in these situations. The McLaren team principal also added how every difficult conversation with the Honey Badger turned into a problem-solving thing, as he was always up for getting to the bottom of the issues. So, according to Stella, it was an extremely positive process, both in terms of improving the performance of the car, but also in terms of the emotional approach, as everyone learned a lot about how to navigate through these tricky times. That's a wrap for this video. Do you think Ricciardo could have won a world championship at Red Bull? Let us know in the comments below. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. See you in the next one.